Hey everyone, this is Derrick Broze of the Conscious Resistance Network, and today I'm bringing you another important interview from a guest that I spoke to just over 6 years ago, actually, Brandon Smith of Alt Market. Last time we spoke was February 2014, discussing non-participation and decentralization, some of which we're going to get into today. But more than that, we're also going to be talking about, I would say, principles and consistency in the state of the world and maybe some blind spots that people on left and right and everywhere in between might be having. But how are you doing today, Brandon?
Oh, pretty good. It's good to be back on your show, Derek.
Yeah, I appreciate all your work. I've followed it over the years since we last spoke. And I just want to say that for those who might not be aware of your website, alt-market.com, I'll put the links in the video and everything like that. But if you want to give just a quick background on how long have you been running the website? And I know you've been active since at least when I first started getting active, which was 10 years now. I think you were already running Alt Market. Why don't you tell everybody a little bit about that before we get into some of your articles?
Sure. Well, I started Alt Market, I believe it was 2011 when I started altmarket.com. And before that, I was doing a website called neithercorp.us, which I started in 2006. So it's been a while now. I think it's 14 years now. So, yeah, I started Neither Corp as just this sort of as more like a blog to vent some of my concerns about where we were headed as a country and a society, and most of my focus was economics, but there was some politics. And then around 2011, I realized that I needed to be a little more proactive. It wasn't just enough to write about problems, but I needed to write about solutions as well, and try to get people a little more organized. And that's what All Market was for, sort of a hub to get people organized around localization and mutual aid, mutual security, preparedness, all of those things. And that's I've been doing that ever since. So.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that. I'm showing on the screen altmarket.com. You have sovereignty, integrity, and prosperity. And as you said, you've talked about over the years mutual aid, getting people not only to sort of recognize the reality and the severity of the situation that we're facing, maybe now more than ever, but to also, not just stop there and have the recognition that things are pretty crazy and the government's out of control, but that we have to actually do something about it and that we have to depend on ourselves if we're going to do something. So it really aligns with the message and the work that we've tried to promote on this channel and on the website, which is why I've just stayed up with your stuff for so long. And now I want to move towards some of the things that you've focused on, at least from what I've seen in the last few months, not only during COVID-19, but increasingly under the Trump administration, where, as you know, a lot of folks who probably consider themselves conservatives or maybe even further back, Tea Party types, Ron Paul types, people questioning the Federal Reserve, questioning government spending, questioning government overreach and police violence and the police state and the surveillance state. People maybe who, from everything from libertarian to different types of conservative, let's say, who under the Trump administration have now chosen to turn a blind eye and a deaf ear to many of the things that Trump has done that clearly are not in line with those values. And I know that that's not always been a popular position for you to take in some of the communities you're in and just in general. Tell us about that, though, like how it's been your experience trying to maintain the same principles with everything going on now during the Trump administration.
Well, it's funny because I started out during the Bush administration, and the current situation is not quite as bad as it was then, but it's similar in that you have a contingent of conservatives who, I think on principle, they appreciate the Constitution, they appreciate civil liberties and individual rights, but they also see those things as inconvenient to certain agendas and to what they see as progress at times. The thing is, constitutional liberties are not they're not contingent upon what your particular agenda is at the moment, and they must be applied to everyone equally. So when we have issues such as like today with the leftist protests and sometimes the leftist riots, BLM riots, Antifa riots, that sort of thing. You know, as abhorrent as those people can be, and as abhorrent as their ideologies can be, you still have to apply constitutional principles to the situation. You can't just supersede, civil rights and civil liberties. You can't just supersede the Constitution to get rid of those people when it suits you. And there's a lot of talk now about doing those sorts of things, and there was, hints of that kind of activity, unconstitutional activity recently in places like Portland, where you saw federal agencies, driving up in unmarked vans, snatching people off the street, basically black bagging them. That sort of stuff is unacceptable. And then there was talk of, in conservative circles, of implementing martial law in order to get rid of the BLM protests and the riots. And again, this is something where once you open that Pandora's box, you can't close it again. And once you allow the government that kind of power, they're never going to give it up. And eventually, they're going to use it against you.
Absolutely. And we're kind of getting into now one of the pieces I'm looking at that really, like I said earlier, I resonate with a lot of your writing. Yeah, so these two that we're going to go over, though, today, as I was reading them, it was just like, yes, finally, somebody's putting in the words that I've been looking for. And myself, I work with people across the spectrum, right-leaning folks, conservatives, people who are maybe more left than I, and different things of that sort. And I can see the hypocrisy just really across the spectrum, like where people on the left are inconsistent with their principles and values. The same people who are saying defund the police are also cheering for cops to arrest people who don't want to wear masks and things like that. So there's hypocrisy to go around for everybody. But in this piece you have here, martial law is unacceptable regardless of the circumstances. That's sort of where you were getting into with the Portland situation as well as others. And like you said there, if you support martial law because it's useful to your apparent political enemies, it will still come back and be a practice that the government uses against anybody who challenges them in any different ways. And I really appreciate that, because there does seem to be a lack of consistency when it comes to these principles. I mean, you said earlier that some people on the right, they believe in these various principles, but then they are at the end of the day, when they're inconvenient, many people have no problem tossing them aside and just moving on. But that, I think, is what's gotten us in this situation. You mentioned the Bush administration. From that, at least that administration, which is around the time myself when I started to question things, but clearly even before then, but definitely the Bush administration, 9/11, as these violations of constitutional liberties were happening, some people, both left and right, were asking questions, were pushing back, and there was big movements of activism, anti-war activism, 9/11 truth activism, Tea Party, Occupy Wall Street, all these sort of things. And it almost appears now that things are, while there still is activism, it's more divided than ever, and it's essentially people cheering on, like, yeah, the left is okay with martial law if it's used against their whoever their enemy is, and the right's okay with it if it's used against Antifa or whatever. How do you think we got to this place? I mean, do you think this is just an inevitability that's coming because of the globalist situation, or do you think this has to do with Trump's role in pushing the world order forward?
Well, I definitely think it's part of a concerted agenda, and back in early 2016, I predicted Trump would win the election based specifically on this outcome. I said that, first of all, I had seen multiple articles in the mainstream media talking about, almost sort of gleefully, the media was cheering the idea that Trump would co-opt the Ron Paul movements, the Tea Party movements, all of the liberty movements, and turn them, either destroy them or turn them into something else. They were talking about this openly in the mainstream media, and I thought that was rather strange that they would almost cheer for the idea that Trump would win, even though they seemed to hate him so much. And the reason they were cheering was because they thought he would eliminate the liberty movement. And so seeing that, and then seeing other elements such as the fact that they were probably going to start bringing down the U.S. economy soon, things like that, it made sense for Trump to be in the White House. If the globalists have as much influence over the U.S. elections and the governmental processes, I believe they do, and I think a lot of people believe they do, then it made sense for them to put Trump into the White House. Now, after the election, it became relatively clear to me that Trump was either controlled opposition and, unaware or fully aware, because of all the elites that he put into his cabinet right after he got into the White House. So the number of, at least 24 CFR people, he has, guys like Mnuchin, Lighthizer, who's CFR, Mnuchin's Goldman Sachs, Pompeo, who's just a long-time deep state. You have Wilbur Ross, who's Rothschild banker. All of these guys are, in my mind, they're his handlers. And after he spoke for so many months about draining the swamp and criticizing Hillary Clinton for all her associations with deep state bankers and Goldman Sachs. And, for him to enter into the White House and immediately, load his cabinet with those same people, it became clear to me that he was controlled. So at that point, it seemed like everything that I had predicted was unfortunately coming to pass, that Trump would be used to divide the liberty movement, which was gaining massive traction long before Trump came onto the scene. I think, we were gaining massive traction. I think that's why they needed Trump. Trump is, in my view, a co-opter and a kind of a saboteur, a way to divide the movement, a way to make a lot of conservatives docile and apathetic, where if Clinton had gone into office, I think a lot more conservatives would be more active, proactive. They would be organizing more aggressively, maybe be willing to fight back against government overstep more aggressively. But with Trump in, it makes a lot of conservatives passive. So there's that. And then as the system continues to collapse, with Trump, a supposed conservative in office, a lot of conservatives will get the blame when everything goes down. That's another advantage the bankers have, is if Hillary Clinton had been in office, well, immediately the globalists and the bankers would get the blame for everything that's happening. But with Trump in, there's much more of a likelihood that conservatives will get the blame.
Yeah, and it's interesting because as you list these different, the CFR members in Trump's cabinets, Rothschild bankers, Goldman Sachs bankers, Rick Perry, who's former governor of Texas, where I'm at, was a Bilderberg attendee. You have clear examples of the kind of people he was going to associate from the beginning, and yet there are still people 4 years later who are kind of hanging on to that illusion. But it's really not much of a surprise because it's just the reverse mirror image of the Obama people who held on after 4 years of drone bombing, and the people who maybe believed he was going to be the savior for them from the left or whatever. And it just seems like that's a part of the agenda, as we know, that the left gets a victory and they get Obama into office, and so the right wing, people who lean more right or conservative or libertarian started standing up and calling out various things that they saw in the Bush administration and saw in the Obama administration. And some people, like yourself and myself, and I think a few others, have stayed consistent throughout that time, including into the Trump administration. But then some people, as you mentioned, get pacified and they fall for it, and maybe they don't want to admit they were wrong, or maybe they really just feel like they need somebody to believe in. Whatever it is, the point is that the agenda carries on, and these folks fall short here. And in the article, you have a kind of a sub headline where you refer to them as sock puppet conservatives, who again like understand the constitutional rights and civil liberties in theory, but they're inconvenient to their goals. And you also kind of get into how the left wing, the leftists, and have been playing into the call for a bigger police state. If we're going to defund the police, but then at the same time the feds are getting empowered, and the right wing calling for the feds to go into certain cities. I mean, we're just seem like we're clearly at a point now. You've been doing this since 2006 or so, and I've been doing it since 2010. It clearly seems like we're at a point now where some of the theories and ideas and issues we've talked about or wrote about are not so distant anymore, especially in light of COVID-19, where people are just essentially embracing medical tyranny, medical martial law. And it's, we've got announcements from Australia. They're one of the first places already making it clear they're going to have a mandatory vaccination, and New Zealand taking people away to quarantine centers. Both those places don't have guns, of course. Just how do you feel knowing all this? It's like, I mean, do you feel like I said a moment ago that things are a lot closer than they appeared maybe a decade ago? Like, it doesn't feel so, like the New World Order in my mind doesn't feel so far away, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because I think we're definitely at a point now where it's safe to say the conspiracy, so-called conspiracy theorists and the preppers were right. And everyone else was wrong. I think it's safe to say that we were right, they were wrong. There's so many instances of, that back everything we've been saying for the past decade or more, that it's, anyone who denies the situation now and denies the need to look into the reality of, globalist conspiracy or look into prepping. Anyone who denies that now is, I think, beyond hope. If you're that stupid, then, we really can't help you. The fact that, we have a pandemic, which, I think for a lot of people now the feeling is that it's being overblown, and I tend to agree, especially in terms of the reaction, the idea that we need to just completely lock down the economy in response to this thing is absurd, because all we're doing is hastening an economic collapse, which will hurt far more people than COVID ever will. And then we have these riots, which are predominantly funded by groups like George Soros's Open Society Foundation and the Ford Foundation. The fact that those groups are rioting, and that the solution that's being presented, of course, is martial law. The solution for the pandemic is, of course, martial law. The fact that we had recently a lot of stores had empty shelves. There's supply chain disruptions. There's a possibility of the supply chain going down completely. This all supports things that we've been saying for many years. So I think it's time for people, if they aren't already, I think it's time for people to accept that, yes, there is a collapse going on in the United States. It is a concerted effort. It's a concerted agenda. It's being engineered to happen, and people need to prepare for it, not just philosophically or ideologically, but also they need to physically prepare for it. So with that in mind, I think that we are, at least I have been seeing a lot of progress in terms of awareness among the general, population, not just in America, but around the world. I think that there is a growing awareness of what is happening. People are starting to look much more closely at the things that we've been writing about and talking about for many years. And so what you have now is this, it's like a race. The globalists have created a race, and it's a double-edged sword for them. So they create this collapse scenario, which they believe will give them a rationale to implement martial law measures. And also, of course, other measures such as complete centralization, a global monetary system, a global economy, eventually a global government. That is their goal. Once they set this in motion, you have millions upon millions of people starting to become aware, and the longer they wait, the more these people will start preparing to fight back. And they don't want that, so it reaches a stage where they have to move fast. They have to move fast to implement these things. Otherwise, too many people will become aware, and then there's too much resistance to the agenda. So I think we're at a point now where things are going to start moving quickly. It's kind of like an avalanche, where the ice builds and builds and builds, and then suddenly everything breaks and it goes down the mountain. I think we're hitting that point now.
Yeah, and you cover some of that in this other piece that I want us to focus on for a moment. Lockdown restrictions are a test to see how much tyranny Americans will accept. And you kind of outline how what you call fourth generation psychological warfare, a no-win scenario where you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. You want to break, I know you kind of just covered that, but what's your main focus of this piece, and what do you mean by fourth generation psychological warfare?
Well, fourth gen warfare has been around a long time. There's multiple military doctrines surrounding it, but it's a very much a propaganda-driven, narrative-driven type of warfare, where the goal is to get a target population to basically destroy itself, so that you don't have to go in with military force and destroy them directly. You get the enemy to commit suicide, basically, rather than have to fight him. And you do that by creating division. You do that by getting the enemy or that target population to abandon their principles and their ideals, to act counter to their morals. And in the process, they become the monster or monsters that they had originally sought to defeat. That's the goal of fourth generation warfare, to take a target population and turn them into something completely different from what they were before, and in that process they self-destruct.
And you kind of point out here that a lot of the back and forth of taking away principled action from left and right and just across the spectrum, any principles that may have existed, that the solution as we move forward with martial law and medical martial law and the riots and the division, the solution, as you point out, is totalitarian government. And there's this kind of meme or this idea that libertarians are these stupid people who still believe that we can somehow have freedom, over security, especially when there's a pandemic going on, because everybody knows, just like with 9/11, you have to abandon principle because everybody's afraid. So talk about that a little bit, because I think, what I'm trying to get at here by reemphasizing this throughout the conversation is the importance of principles, which clearly you have, and clearly Alt-Market has stayed consistent and principled throughout the last decade and through 3 administrations now, and that's not something that is unfortunately very, very popular at the moment. So talk a little bit about that and why you think, clearly you think that part of the agenda was to specifically go after and destroy the liberty, freedom-minded movement that has existed and, as you stated, has been growing and probably is still growing despite everything they're doing.
Right, yeah. It's any society, any culture is going to be built on certain ideals, certain principles. And if you want to destroy that society or culture, there's 2 ways you can do it. You can come at them directly. You can try to destroy them militarily, or try to imprison them, enslave them, that sort of thing by force. Or you can, infiltrate and sabotage them indirectly. And fourth generation warfare, that's basically the goal, is to sabotage a society indirectly, primarily by getting them to abandon the ideals that make up their foundation. This is also very common in sort of a Marxist communist philosophy. The idea is to break up, divide, and destroy society from within. Target their founding principles, their founding ideals, get them to abandon those things. And then when that society burns itself down, you swoop in and rebuild it in the image that you prefer after the ashes settle. So that's exactly what's going on right now. The U.S. in particular, I think, is being targeted because there is a massive contingent of liberty-minded people, and those people are also armed. They have the capacity to defend themselves. Unlike in places like Australia or New Zealand right now, as you said, there's a very fast-moving program to lock those people down, get them under control. They're implementing totalitarian policies, even to the point in New Zealand where they have what they're calling quarantine facilities, which are basically quarantine camps, where you can be separated from your family and locked up. And these facilities are under military control right now. So all the things that people were supposed to despise. We see images constantly of Nazi concentration camps, or we talk of Russian gulags. This is not much different than that. It's really not, and you have people cheering for this in certain parts of the world. In America, I think that we are going to be targeted even harder than places like Australia and New Zealand, because we have the ability to change the course of the situation. We have the ability to fight back, unlike them. So what I would expect is, especially in terms of the economy, we're going to see a very hard economic crash. They're going to try to create desperation within the culture to the point that people will accept almost anything in order to just feel safe, even if that safety is a facade. They're going to try to create enough desperation to get people to go along with totalitarian measures in order to just not feel fear every day. Will people go along with that? I think some will, especially in states where you have a predominantly leftist or progressive system. Places like California, Illinois, New York, I think in terms of the pandemic, you could see a similar situation to what they have in New Zealand or Australia right now. But I'm an optimist. I know it doesn't sound like it, but I actually am. And I really don't believe that a lot of the American population will go along with martial law measures. Even under the worst conditions, I think people still value their freedom, and they're willing to fight for it.
Yeah, I sure hope so. I try to be an optimist as well, but I'm also a realist like yourself, Brandon. Before we start to wrap up with the most important part of your work, and I think that what everybody needs to focus on, that's solutions, I want to jump back to the other article for a second, just with something you put towards the end in the martial law article. You listed these 3 uncomfortable questions that I think absolutely need to be asked by people who are maybe still buying into various elements of the narrative, whether that is the idea that Trump is a good guy trying to fight the Antifa and BLM, and that's why we need to support martial law and things of that sort, or if you're falling for the giving away the WHO and other globalist organizations, or even local and state organizations, these medical martial law powers. So I just wanted to read these real quick, briefly, because I think that they are extremely important that you highlighted these. The first one is, why is it that the Trump administration has not bothered to go after the elites and globalists funding Antifa and BLM groups? Why does George Soros and his Open Society Foundation continue to operate in the U.S. with impunity? And same for the Ford Foundation. And then number two, you say, if we support martial law measures, who are we giving that power to? Is it Trump or the deep state that advise him daily? And then, as you mentioned earlier, Wilbur Ross, Mike Pompeo, all the various CFR goons, former Fed folks, and Goldman Sachs. Number three, and this is again in the idea that those who support sending in troops or federal agents of any kind, because it doesn't really matter if they're coming from the DoD, the specific military, or if it's a militarized DHS agent, it's all the same at the end. And you said, when the left is defeated and the riots stop, will martial law simply fade away, or is it a Pandora's box that we can never be closed again? And I think those are all really important things to consider when you're looking at it. And then you end with real solutions, and this is where I think another area where our work tends to overlap here. I know on the front of Alt Market you have this section for local alt market groups, and just decentralization is something you write about and talk about. That's something that we talk about here too. We have a website called freedomcells.org, is just basically encouraging people to meet digitally, but to start organizing in real world, having real world meetings, and organizing to just be prepared for emergencies, to train each other, to share ideas and resources. And I think that's what it looks like you have established here as well. So you want to talk a little bit about that, and just why you still, it's been 6 years since we last talked, why you still believe non-participation and decentralization are the solutions.
Right. Well, because they're the opposite of what the globalists are seeking, and the globalists are seeking total centralization of everything. So, up to the point of, where they talk at Davos about the shared economy, and you don't own any property. Everything you have belongs to the state, or it belongs to some kind of community center where you don't own a car. You have to borrow a car that 20 other people are also using. You don't own your house. You have this community home that you share. All of these things that we take for granted as being ours, they want to take away, and that's just at the personal level. And then on the global level, they want to centralize everything. They want to centralize the economy, the monetary system, government. Everything becomes global. Everything becomes a faceless bureaucracy that never answers to the people. And that's what they prefer to happen. That's what they want to happen. The more you see centralization, the more that centralization requires people to be dependent. In order for a centralized system to function, the people have to be dependent on it for their survival. And that is where we're headed already. We see a lot of elements of this, such as interdependency among economies. So, for example, right now it's a huge problem that we have this pandemic situation and possible supply chain breakdowns, and you have the U.S., the people in the U.S., completely dependent on a country like China for 95% or more of their medical goods. Why are we that dependent on a country that we're opposed to ideologically for our medical goods? They could simply just shut off the spigot, and they could destroy half this country by refusing to send us the medical goods that we need. That doesn't make any sense unless you look at it from the perspective of globalism and the globalists. The more interdependent these nations are, the more they can be controlled in the future. And that interdependency will extend down to the average person, where in the future they'll have UBI, which is Universal Basic Income, and people will be waiting around for that UBI check once a month because they won't be able to get a job. Most of them won't be able to get a job Their entire survival will be dependent on the government. And so if you're dependent on the government for your survival, what are the chances of you actually rebelling against that government when they do terrible things? Pretty low. The chances are pretty low. So that's the future that they want, and so that the solution to that is to completely decentralize and become independent from the system. The solution is for millions of people to learn how to provide necessities for themselves, and not only to prep, but to become producers. And not only for individuals to become producers, but for them to also organize locally with other producers. And if Americans, specifically Americans, can do that, then what happens is we present an organized obstacle, an organized opposition to globalization that's much harder to frighten or defeat. If there's an economic collapse, but your community is localized, and you've set up, a lot of you are producers, a lot of you are preppers, a lot of you have set up barter systems and that sort of thing, then that economic collapse is not going to disrupt your entire life as much as other people, and you're not going to feel that fear or lack of security that other people will feel. So you will be ready to defend yourself and to speak up in the event that the government goes totalitarian during this economic crisis. That's what they don't want. So I say if it's something they don't want, then it's something that we need to do immediately. Localization, preparedness, mutual aid, community organization and security. These are things that have to happen right now if we want to keep our freedoms for the foreseeable future.
Absolutely. I agree with you 100%. Well, thank you so much, Brandon, for giving me some of your time this morning. Again, everyone who's listening, the website is alt-market.com. I'll put the links below and links to the two articles we were discussing. And for anybody who wants to go back and hear our conversation from 2014, I'll throw that in. Anything else you want to leave, or anywhere else people can find you?
Well, they can visit me at alt-market.com, and I also have a newsletter I've been doing for the past year called the Wild Bunch Dispatch, which focuses more on the solutions and preparedness side of things.
Awesome. Well, everybody check that out. Until next time, this has been Derrick Broze of the Conscious Resistance. Thank you for listening.